Thank you. Well, you know, it's amazing to me that I'm standing here with all of you in Toronto, with the Tamarack Institute, and with others who are contributing to this movement. Because, you know, it was only about 2 years ago, shortly after we wrote our first article on collective impact, that I got a call from this gentleman from Waterloo. And his name was Paul Bourne, in case you're wondering. And I thought he was a very nice gentleman, very polite, very charming. And he said, you know, we'd really love you to come up. We're having our annual Tamarack Institute conference, and this year it's going to be in Calgary, and we'd love to have you come up and speak with our folks. And of course, like all of us, we've got tons of things going on, and certainly we've gotten many, many contacts around the initial article, speaking requests from, you know, really all over the world. And my first reaction was to sort of politely put Paul off and to say, well, thank you so much for calling. I'm sure you're doing great work. Unfortunately, I just can't make it. But for those of you who know Paul, and Rathna talked about this earlier, Paul does not take no for an answer, and he's so darn charming about it that I finally relented. And the other thing I will tell you, though, along the way, that I was taken with Paul's charm, but I was also taken with the fact that as we got to talking, I could tell this was somebody who really understood this work at a deep level. Now, I've only been working in the social sector for 11 years. My background prior to that was working in strategy consulting in the private sector for about 15 years, mostly with large global corporations. And, you know, I felt like, gee, you know, we published this article, we're doing great work, but what the heck do we really know about this sort of work? And I had this inkling. We had never done work at the time in Canada, but I did have this inkling, you know, being out there and sort of in the mix of what was going on, that there was really some pretty, you know, extraordinary and compelling and interesting work being done in Canada around systems change. I hadn't been directly connected to it, but I could just see that it was there. Through, you know, the work that SIG has been doing around systems change, and Francis Wesley and Brendan Zimmerman, who will be here later, had been doing around complexity and around strategy, and of course, you know, the initial work done by Henry Mintzberg over the last several years or decades around emergent strategy, and I knew that, you know, I just had to get up here. And I had to get a better understanding so that I could learn what all of you are doing, and to get a sort of a better bead on how we could bring a lot of the learning that is happening here back to the United States, but also really around the globe. And that initial meeting was a real opportunity for us to really get a better introduction to, you know, what's going on here. And I feel like we have just scratched the surface. You all are doing some amazing work up here, and sometimes I'm sure it doesn't always feel like that, but you're really on to, you know, a lot of things that, frankly, while, you know, we may be the place where, you know, we try things out and make mistakes, I think there's a lot of innovation going on here that we can learn from. So I'm delighted to be here with you for the next 2.5 days. You know, when we think about sort of collective impact, you know, one of the questions that I often get is, you know, where'd you guys come up with that? You know, how did that come into being? How was collective impact birthed? And so I want to just give you a very brief story. I don't know if it's a compelling or fascinating story, but it's a true story in terms of how we actually came up with collective impact. Faye Hanley-Brown, who you'll hear from, and myself, and a number of our other colleagues, probably about 15 at the time, our senior management at FSG, got together. The focus for FSG stands for Foundation Strategy Group, but we work cross-sector at this point. And our sole focus is really strategies for social change. And we got together back in about 2008. And we asked ourselves as a group, what was sort of the number one reason and the number one thing that we could focus on to bring about faster, better, more accelerated social change. There were about 15 of us. We broke up into groups of 3 or 4. We talked about it for a while, and we came back together and said, what do we got? And what was amazing was that each and every group essentially came up with the same notion that today we're calling collective impact. We actually, in our first iteration, called it concerted action. But it was very mystical. It was like sort of a breeze went through the room as each and every group came back and said, what's going to accelerate social change in terms of better, faster, and quicker progress around all these serious social and environmental issues we face, is if we think about cross-sector collaborations that come together in a better and different way than they have in the past. And that was what led us to ultimately doing initially some research around, collaboration, because most collaborations historically have failed to achieve positive and consistent progress at scale. And that was really the barrier or the hurdle that we wanted to put on things in terms of better understanding how we could achieve collective impact. And that ultimately led to establishing what many of you hopefully know at this point, or what we talked about as the 5 conditions for collective impact: common agenda, shared measurement, mutually reinforcing activities, continuous communication, and the existence of a backbone organization. Now I want to talk a little bit for a minute about backbones. In our first iteration of this thinking, we didn't refer to all of you and to this notion of an organization that aligns and coordinates activity as a backbone organization. We actually called it infrastructure. And as we were working through the concept, and Mark Kramer and I, my co-author of the initial article, were going back and forth on iterations. I was sitting in the Delta Air Marine Terminal, which is at LaGuardia, and I got this text from my colleague Mark, who was reading my sort of latest version of the article, and all it said was, infrastructure. That's really boring. Can we come up with anything better? And my flight had been delayed for about an hour and a half, and I took that text and I sat down with a beer or two and thought, what's better than infrastructure? And then somehow it popped into my head, backbone. This is what it's all about, right? You've got, all these different sort of elements of the body, and how can anybody function without a backbone? And now Rathna has given me sort of a new insight into this that I sort of think is the backbone of what picks us up. But we do need to recognize that, backbones, so speaking as somebody who occasionally gets a sore back, that backbones do themselves need support, and that's why we're all here together. It's been sort of an amazing 2.5 years since the initial article of Collective Impact came out. In some respects, in many respects, it really is building off of work that has been going on for decades. What's really exciting is that for all of you that are doing the work, I think hopefully the contribution has given all of you who are doing this work and others a shot in the arm. As I've observed sort of why this has happened and what we can take away from the excitement and the tremendous resonance about collective impact really worldwide at this point, there are 3 things that I see as real positives. One is that, excitedly, it has really given participants in social change who may not even have thought of themselves as participants, whether or not they were business or government in particular, it's given them sort of access and an easier way to think about, call it what you want, comprehensive community change, something where people's eyes typically glaze over. So hopefully, we've got something that's more aspirational and accessible to many who don't think about this work on a daily basis. It's exciting to see that many who have been doing this work for a while are coming together behind a common language, because as Paul said earlier, that's really critical to a movement. And it's really great to see the common language that's growing around this, around the world. And I think importantly, this work hopefully gives us all a higher bar for what it means to collaborate effectively. Because we've all been involved with collaborations that haven't gone anywhere. And as I mentioned earlier, the majority of collaborations have failed, and we really do see the 5 conditions of collective impact as critical, and that those efforts, that collaborative efforts, cross-sector collaborative efforts, that are engaged in these 5 activities and think about these 5 conditions, that will propel them. It's not guaranteed, but a much greater likelihood of actually achieving positive and consistent progress at scale. But here's the rub, and we'll spend a little bit of time talking about this later in the afternoon with Brenda. Here's the rub. It's great that we all now have a common language and a way of thinking about this. But make no mistake, this is not easy or simple work. It's complex. It's incredibly nuanced. So I think the next step for all of us, as we get more comfortable with the language and as we talk in a way that we can each understand what the other is saying, that we have to continue to make it accessible, not only for ourselves, but for others we need to invite in. Albert Einstein once said, and you've all heard this, everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. So that's really my goal, and that's my intent as I continue to sort of walk down the lane in this work, is how we can all together make this work as simple as possible, but not simpler. So I'm delighted to be here with you for the next 2.5 days. I think we've got sort of a fun set of activities that all of you can hopefully engage in, and I'll turn it right back to Paul right now. Thank you.